Hi again, Kenneth Scott Latourette, History of Christianity, page 241. Two short subsections here in his chapter, Earthen Vessels, the Exceeding Greatness of the Power. What he's thinking about in this chapter is the growth of Christianity and how inexplicable it is from a worldly viewpoint. That is, where did the power come from to turn Christianity from a minor sect of Judaism into the most morally and ethically powerful religion in the world by 300 AD? And he has two short subheads. This one is the tension between early Christians and the world, and he has the world in quotation marks, and also Christians and war during those early centuries. From the beginning, Christians felt themselves in opposition to what they called the world. They recognized the antagonism between Jesus on the one hand, and on the other hand, the state in which they were set and which had brought about the crucifixion of Jesus and the chronic persecution of his followers. This contrast found dramatic expression in Augustine's City of God, with its sharply drawn distinction between the city of the world and the city of God. But that famous book was the more important because it was an amplification by a first-class mind of views already cherished by Christians. Many tended to identify the church with the city of God. Even Augustine seemed at times to do so. Certainly as it grew, the Catholic Church, notice he doesn't say Roman Catholic Church here, because that dominance of Rome was not clear yet in the year 400 when Augustine wrote the City of God, around the year 400 when Augustine wrote the City of God. Certainly as it grew, the Catholic Church became a distinct society within the empire, but not fully of it, a kind of imperium in imperio. It had its rules and laws, the beginnings of its canon law, administered by its own officers, the clergy, alongside the state. This contributed to the contrast between Christians and the society in which they were immersed. Moreover, as we pointed out in a previous chapter, the Christian view of human history differed radically from that of the Greco-Roman world. It was the contrast between fate and destiny. The Greeks, and in this Roman thinkers followed them, regarded history as endlessly repeating itself in a series of cycles, so that what is now had been in some earlier stage of man's career and would be again in later eras. Blind fate determined it. Here was a weary, pessimistic appraisal of man's course. To the Christian, in striking contrast, human history has God as its sovereign, begins with God's creation of man, and will go on to a climax in which God will still be master. Christians saw in history a cosmic drama centering about man's creation, with freedom of will, man's sin, and the redemption of man through the incarnation, the cross, the resurrection, and the coming of the Holy Spirit. Through Christ, so Christians believed, fallen sinful man could be transformed and grow into fellowship with God and in likeness to him. This gave to man a dignity and a worth, and to history a meaning, which Greco-Roman thought had not known. Christians differed as to when the climax to history would arrive and as to its precise nature, yet the early Christians held that God was even now master, that while the climax had not yet come, it was near. Paul said that the day is at hand, and that Christians should even now walk honestly, as in the day where God's will is perfectly done. Jesus seemed to say that here and now men could enter that kingdom where God's will is the rule, in a realized eschatology, as it's generally called even today, the end of history, which for them had already dawned. Many believed that the climax would be in a second coming of Christ. Some sought to discover the precise date of that coming, while others, while convinced that it would be, held that no man could know the day or the hour. Origen was convinced that the Word, the Logos, would prevail over the entire rational creation and change every soul into his own perfection, and that the consummation of all things is the destruction of evil, although as to the question whether it shall be so destroyed that it can never anywhere rise again, it is beyond our present purpose to say. That's the words of Origen. Many, among whom was Augustine, taught that perfection could never be realized within history, but only beyond it, in heaven. The opposition between Christians and the world was partially allayed, as we have suggested, as the centuries wore on. Leaders of the church held the latter to be like Noah's Ark, that is, the church is Noah's Ark, in which were all, both good and bad. Christianity tended to fuse with Platonism and Stoicism. Stoicism was utilized by Christian thinkers to afford a theoretical foundation to ethics. To the Stoic, there was in the universe a dominant divine reason, from which came a moral natural law. Some of the Christian intellectuals held that this natural law of the Stoics was identical with Christian moral law. Yet this convenient accommodation did not entirely erase the contrast between Christianity and the world in which it had to operate. Now the Christians and war. One of the issues on which the early Christians were at variance with the Greco-Roman world was participation in war. For the first 3 centuries, no Christian writing which has survived to our time condoned Christian participation in war. Some Christians held that for them, all bloodshed, whether as soldiers or as executioners, was unlawful. At one stage in its history, the influential Church of Alexandria seems to have looked askance upon receiving soldiers into its membership, and to have permitted enlistment in the legions only in exceptional circumstances. Hippolytus, prominent in Rome, in putting down in writing what he believed to be the apostolic tradition, and so the authentic Christian teaching, maintained that when he applied for admission to the Christian fellowship, a soldier must refuse to kill men, even if he were commanded by his superior to do so, and must also not take an oath, and that military commanders must resign if they were to continue as catechumens. Let me pronounce that again, because I've been corrected on this several times. Catechumens or catechumens. That's Catechumens. Means, of course, just people who are preparing for baptism. A baptized person and one preparing for baptism, so Hippolytus said, who sought to enlist as a soldier must be cut off from the church. Tertullian argued against Christians being members of the Roman armies on the ground that this brought one under a master other than Christ, that it entailed taking the sword, and that even when the army was used for police purposes in peacetime, it made necessary the infliction of punishment when all revenge was forbidden to the Christian. He said, that is, Tertullian said, that in disarming Peter, Christ ungirded every soldier. Another consideration which weighed against service in the armies was the strong possibility that as a soldier, the Christian would be required to take part in idolatrous rites. Some Christians would permit service in the legions in times of or areas of peace, when the function of the army was that of the police, but they frowned upon it in war. So clear was the opposition of the early Christians to bearing arms that Celsus, or Celsus, in his famous attack on them, declared that if all were to do as did the Christians, the empire would fall victim to the wildest and most lawless barbarians. In replying, Origen did not deny that Christians were pacifists. Indeed, he said that Christians do not fight under the emperor, although he require it. Instead, he argued that if all were to become Christians, the barbarians would also be Christian, and that even now, when Christians were in the minority, their love, labor, and prayers were doing more than Roman arms to preserve the realm. For the early Christians, pacifism was largely theoretical, for they were chiefly from groups other than those from which the legions were recruited, and they did not have the responsibility for formulating state policy. In spite of the general trend among Christians towards pacifism, in the 3rd century, the numbers of Christians serving in the legions seem to have increased. This was especially the case on the frontiers, menaced as they were by invasion, and in the West. Moreover, after the emperors had espoused Christianity, and they and Christian officials were charged with the responsibility for the body politic and for making decisions for the government, the attitude of the majority of Christians towards war changed. Christians now began to believe that some wars are just, That was the position taken by Ambrose of Milan. Augustine elaborated the theoretical basis for a just war. He held that wickedness must be restrained, by force if necessary, and that the sword of the magistrate is divinely commissioned. Not all wars are just. To be just, so Augustine said, a war must be waged under the authority of the prince. It must have as its object the punishment of injustice and the restoration of peace, and it must be fought without vindictiveness and without unnecessary violence. It must also be carried on with inward love. Yet without the authority of the prince, Augustine taught, the civilian must not use force to defend even his own life. The clergy and the monks were to be entirely exempt from military service. It was this principle of a righteous or just war which was held by the large proportion of Christians in subsequent centuries. Next time, Christians and public amusements and Christians and slavery. Put in a link to the earliest belief, the premillennial hope, which of course built up the expectation in the mind of all Christians who held it, that the coming of the Lord was soon. Alluded to here, but not emphatically. And the truth is that the premillennial position was by far the dominant position of the great thinkers of the early church, up until the era of Constantine at least. So I'll put in a link to Justin Martyr, the 2 videos really, about what he said about the premillennial hope that Christians held in his day, around 150 AD. The first of those is on your screen. See you soon.